Hello, good afternoon. This is the fourth Congress for Peace Building in Gender Perspective. In this afternoon, we're so happy. This is our closing panel, panel 18, organized by the Institute for Women, Peace and Security, Georgetown University. Different perspectives in women agenda, peace, security, climate, negotiation of violence against women. And in this panel, we're going to have our colleague Luis Mancilla as moderator. He is at the Institute for Women, Peace and Security. He participated in the design and implementation of activities while he was working at an NGO in public health. He also contributes with his experience in business development, working for a company of international development. He has a master in public and international affairs. In order to welcome you, we have our colleague Dulce Ramos, coordinator of the Program for Sustainability at Iberoamericana University. Welcome, Dulce. Thank you. I want to thank for the opportunity that you had given me to welcome everyone to the last panel of the fourth Congress of Peace Building with Gender Perspective. I take this opportunity to congratulate Dr. Elvia González del Pliego and everyone who had made possible to have this splendid space of exchange and reflection. The main problems that bring us here are so convoluted. We have multiple factors that are closely related. The climate emergence is one of them. The negative effects of the situation, like heat waves, fires, flooding, drought, make it worse every day and affect millions of people all over the world, causing hunger, loss of places and livelihoods. Climate change has an impact on everyone, but particularly on those people in the less favored groups, among which women are the ones that suffer the most. They suffer directly the effects. Likewise, they have less capacities to adapt or to prepare to survive and recover from disasters. At the same time, women are minorities in decision making in policies with respect to energy and climate strategies. We cannot think about climate change without thinking that it's related to gender inequalities, immigration flows, security, and peace. At the Office of Incidents at this university, we're trying to set bridges, to build bridges in the different topics that we take care of so we can understand problems from a complex perspective that allows us to approach them in a more effective manner. I'm sure that this panel would be a great space for exchange and reflection where we can learn so much. Thank you, and I give the floor to Dr. Gonzalez once again. Thank you, dear Dulce. In order to start with this panel, I'm going to give the floor our dear ambassador, Melan Verver, who has been a promoter of this Congress since we started in 2017, and who we have great feelings for her and thankful for her support in this effort year after year. Thank you, Melan. Thank you, Luis, for your trust, for your support, for being here with us, and for this wonderful panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elvia, and good afternoon, buenos tardes. For those of you who are speaking Spanish, you can have the translation into English if you go to the bottom of your screen where the indicator is there for the translation. I am so happy to be here on behalf of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. and to join you for this concluding panel that's focused on 3 different perspectives on the women, peace, and security agenda. 4 years ago, when Iberoamericano University in Mexico City was embarking on its first conference on peace building from a gender perspective, I received an email from Elvia, the coordinator, and she said, here's what I am trying to do. We are a sister Jesuit university. You need to be engaged with us. And you are working on the issues that we want to act more significantly on here in Latin America. And for that reason, you must come and be with us. And we have been partners ever since. So Elvia, we are especially happy that Georgetown and Ibero could come together once again. It is especially fitting that this year, your conference is taking place at the confluence of 2 directly related United Nations anniversaries. The 4th UN World Conference on Women took place in Beijing 25 years ago. 189 countries by consensus adopted a platform for action. Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights. Among other imperatives, it laid out the obligations of states to protect women in conflict and recognize that the active participation of women and their engagement in all levels of peace building and decision making was necessary if peace was to be achieved. 5 years later, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325, and again, specifically linked women's agency to peace and security, stressing women's vital participation in peace building, conflict resolution, and relief and recovery. This conference is also taking place in the midst of a pandemic, an enormous humanitarian crisis that has disproportionately affected women and exposed the deep inequalities in our societies. It has, at alarming rates, exacerbated violence against women. And the conditions for local peace builders have become that much more difficult as a result. Our panel will focus on aspects of peace and security. One key area is women's participation in peace negotiations to bring an end to conflict. We know today from many studies, from a plethora of research, that women make a positive difference when they can meaningfully influence negotiations. When they're able to influence the talks, there is a much higher chance that agreements will be reached and peace will be sustained. And one of the most inclusive peace processes to ever take place took place in this hemisphere to end and to bring an end to the war that had gone on for 50 years in Colombia. Women played a prominent role in the talks, including as negotiators. Moreover, the testimony of women victimized by the war was an important part of the process. The talks guaranteed a gendered approach to peacemaking, what this conference is all about. Another important consideration is the role of violence against women. It is pervasive, something we all know, and it threatens the security and safety of its victims, and it also represents a bigger security concern for all of society. It can no longer be overlooked simply as a marginal issue. According to our index that we put out every other year, the Women, Peace, and Security Index that looks at the well-being of women. Where violence against women is prevalent, there is a direct correlation to instability and conflict. The security of women is one of the most reliable indicators for a peaceful state. And the final aspect for our panel to discuss is climate change. You already heard from Dulce at the opening that it is an existential threat, the ultimate threat multiplier, a defining risk to peace and security. And once again, the Security Council of the United Nations, addressing peace and security on 1325, recognized the connection between gender, climate, and conflict in the context of the framework. Future conflicts and political tensions are likely to get worse by vanishing natural resources, especially water, resulting in the earth being scorched, depriving farmers of their livelihood. Climate displacement is already creating a whole new class of climate refugees. Its impacts are already increasing the insecurity of those vulnerable communities. And again, it is happening in the region. Lastly, I want to mention the Georgetown podcast series, Seeking Peace. We are in our second season, and this season have several episodes focused on peace builders and human rights defenders here in the hemisphere. So please listen to the podcasts if you're interested, and go to seekingpeacepodcast.com. And now let me turn the floor over to my colleague, Luis Mancia, who you already heard is the Assistant Director of Finance and Administration at our Institute. He will be the moderator of this panel. He will proceed in Spanish and introduce our very distinguished speakers. So gracias. Thank you all very, very much.
Gracias, embajadora, por tus palabras tan importantes.
Thank you, Ambassador, for such important words that help us to set the situation for the next discussions. We're going to have simultaneous interpretation, so choose your language of choice by pressing the language button at the bottom of the screen. Before we start with introductions, first of all, I want to take a minute to thank Elvia, Jorge, and everyone else at Ibero who have worked so hard for so many months to provide us with this conference in its fourth year. Likewise, I want to acknowledge all our colleagues who have provided us with interesting speeches for the last 2 weeks of this conference. I've learned so much, and I felt the importance of promoting these topics beyond our immediate surroundings. Now, a few words for our audience, those of you connected in Zoom and YouTube. Thank you for participating. Put together your questions at the chat at the bottom of the screen if you're using Zoom, or to the email that Ibero has set for you. Please indicate who your question is directed to, as well as your name, organization, and we're going to be answering to your questions at the end of the panel. We now start with the first panelist. It's a pleasure to welcome Brianna Mall. Brianna worked at our institute a few years ago as our colleague in investigation. She is currently principal investigator at the Regional Office for Central America, North America, and the Caribbean at the International Association for Migrations, OIM. Mariana, we know that the situation with climate change is a big problem, a problem where the consequences have to do with massive displacement with environmental migration, specifically in Central America. And we can think that displacement takes us to so much conflict. And within this conflict, we have seen that women are problem solvers. That is, women must be active leaders. And we see this in so many places in the world. Please tell us what you are investigating, the problems, as well as some solutions in this topic of climate change. Brianna, you have the floor.
Gracias. Buenas tardes a todos y todas. Muchas gracias
Good
por la
afternoon,
invitación de
everyone.
ser parte de
Thank
esta
you for inviting me
discusión
to be
y
part of this
continuaré en
discussion.
inglés para más
And I'm
claridad de
going to
mi parte.
continue in English.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm honored to be part of this panel. It's wonderful to be back with Ambassador Rivera and Luis, who I've loved working with in the past. Just to note at the beginning that these will be my own opinions and are not necessarily representative of formal opinions or perspectives of IOM. Climate change, as has been discussed already, is one of the defining challenges of our time and will fundamentally affect both migration flows and how displacement happens in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also around the world. It's a global issue, but these impacts vary significantly by country, by community, and by gender. Understanding and addressing this big nexus, the nexus of climate change, migration, displacement, and gender, is critical for creating more effective policies and for facilitating more inclusive responses. Climate change is often just one of a variety of factors in contributing to conflict or a situation of displacement. It can often be hard to say that just one factor caused a conflict or displacement, but there are some key examples where climate change has played a critical role. For instance, in conflict between pastoralists or farmers in East Africa and in Mali, or the well-documented case of drought in Syria and the current conflict. In the conflict angle, certainly in the Caribbean, displacement happens each year during hurricane season, as unfortunately we've seen this year with so many hurricanes in the Atlantic. Investing in women in conflict prevention and resolution, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and disaster response and recovery are all key to responding to this increasingly complex nexus of challenges. My remarks will be largely global in scope, though I have included specific examples. And I just want to note that different communities and different countries look different and have different responses to climate change as well. So there's a lot of opportunity for more research in this field as well. As I'm sure many of you know, climate change has many different manifestations. It can occur through rapid onset events such as storms or landslides, but it can also occur through slow onset degradation, including desertification or drought. Rising sea levels and coastal erosion threaten many low-lying areas, particularly in communities like the Caribbean. Much of my work currently focuses on the Caribbean, so I'll give you an example from that region. Much of the population in the Caribbean lives on the coastline, and much of the infrastructure, including businesses, centers of tourism, airports, are also along the coastline. Of the region's 44 million inhabitants, more than 50% live within 1.5 kilometers of the coastline, and about a third of the total population lives in low elevation zones less than 10 meters above sea level. So climate change for these communities is really an existential challenge. I'm going to speak mostly about displacement today, but I just want to note that there's a broader range of human mobility related to climate change and disasters. So broadly speaking, thinking about environmental migration is not just displacement. People may make the choice strategically to move in order to save lives and livelihoods, to find better opportunities for themselves and their families. There are also other types of mobility, such as planned relocation, in which a community is moved or decides to move long-term in order to prevent future risk of disasters. So just to note that while I will focus mostly on displacement, which is kind of a rapid need to leave or a forced leaving of a place in response to a hazard, there are other types of migration and mobility that are important and can be very positive choices for communities that are at risk currently. I also want to note that I'll be speaking about women broadly, but not all women are equally vulnerable. Certainly, it varies by communities, and women with other economic or social vulnerabilities may be more affected or less secure in the wake of climate change and disasters. Depending on the community, this can be particularly severe for Indigenous, widowed, and poor women, or women of certain religious or ethnic groups, depending on the community. Certainly across Latin America, women are key actors in fighting for conservation and fighting against land degradation. And so those women are particular leaders in those communities. Broadly speaking, we know that men and women often face different burdens as a result of climate change and more intense or extreme weather events. Primarily in rural communities, but also in less developed countries, women and girls tend to be in charge of unpaid housework and caregiving. And this becomes more challenging and more time consuming as a result of impacts on water availability and food production. This leads to a real lack of loss of productive time. This is also linked to conflict. So around the world, 31 million girls of primary school age are out of school, and more than a third of children globally who are out of school live in conflict-affected communities. And for adolescent girls in conflict zones, they're 90% more likely to be kept out of school than girls in conflict-free countries. So when you have communities where these challenges overlap, it's a significant threat to girls and women achieving educational attainment and moving on to productive and fulfilling work in their lives. We also know that women and girls are often challenged in lack of access to early warning about natural hazards, and that their ongoing socioeconomic marginalization increases their vulnerability after disasters. For example, this can look like lack of proof of land ownership, lack of literal ability to get to the place where resources are being given out in the aftermath of a disaster. I'll give you another example from the Caribbean. Climate change will impact women particularly because it will affect the tourism and accommodation sectors, where women make up 60% of employees in that sector in the Caribbean. We know that globally, agriculture and the informal sectors will be affected by climate change, and women also play key roles in those sectors globally. I also want to note that, of course, men, boys, LGBTQ, and non-binary people are also affected by climate change. We know that men may be uniquely vulnerable to heat-related injuries related to outdoor work, and that often their needs for mental health care are not taken into consideration in the same way in the aftermath. There's little focus on the impacts of climate change on LGBTQ folks, so just to note that there's an opportunity for much more learning and research in that area. So I'll turn more specifically now to disaster displacement. Of the 33.4 million newly displaced people in 2019, 70% were due to climate-related disasters. Between 2008 and 2018, 90% of people displaced by disasters, which was 23 million people, had weather-related triggers. Predictions of future climate-related displacement vary greatly. It's a source of a lot of debate, but some of these estimates reach up to 250 million people displaced by 2050. One study found that people were twice as likely to be displaced in 2015 as in the 1970s due to disasters. So it's a critical issue for us to create frameworks that are gender inclusive and gender responsive to be thinking about these problems. In 2018, more than half of the 41 million displaced people around the world were women. We know that women are more likely than men to die during and in the aftermath of disasters. And as I mentioned earlier, their ongoing marginalization affects their vulnerability after disasters. However, this is mitigated in places where economic and social rights are more equally distributed between women and men. So this means that supporting broader women's equality movement, supporting women in education and in careers and in leadership positions can help mitigate this disparity in mortality rates during disasters. Women are particularly vulnerable during disasters because they often lack access to and control over resources and livelihood opportunities, which in turn reduces their resilience to shocks and natural hazards. I'll give you an example from some work I did with GWIPs. We worked on a report looking at Nepal following the 2015 earthquake, and we found that women's lack of documentation, both in citizenship proof and also land ownership, directly impacted their result to receive aid in the aftermath of disaster. Without having that piece of paper that proves that you're entitled to aid, many women and their families struggled. However, in all of these communities around the world, we also know that women are always active. There are women's organizations, both formal and informal, that jump into action in the aftermath of crises. A similar example from Nepal, we found that women's organizations immediately took action following the earthquake. Even if disaster response was not part of their regular activities, they pivoted their funding or their staff to work on emergency response. We also found that women founded informal response mechanisms in their communities to feed their neighbors or to create safe spaces for women. I do want to highlight that we know that gender-based violence and domestic violence and human trafficking increase following disasters. I want to point you to a recent report by the International Union for Conservation of Nature on gender-based violence and the environment. It's much broader than specific disaster displacement, but it's a very thorough discussion of all the ways the environment and GBV are interconnected. And I also want to highlight that in relation to human trafficking, on a study I did looking at trafficking in the Mekong Delta, people cited not necessarily climate change or disaster as the reason that they moved and thus unfortunately became exploited, but that they'll cite a lack of livelihood or a loss of their work. But if you look at the regions where these people live, they're the areas that were degraded, particularly in Cambodia, degraded by flooding or landslides. So there's a connection between environmental degradation, migration or displacement, and then sometimes, unfortunately, exploitation as a result. So paying attention to these complex and interrelated trends is key. So where's the connection to conflict specifically? According to UN OCHA, 8 of the world's worst food crises are linked to both conflict and climate shocks. These issues are inherently related. When you look at the countries that make the top lists of most at risk for climate change impacts and most at risk of conflict, they're almost the same list. There's a connection between politically fragile or conflict-affected states and states at risk of climate change. I want to highlight here that as climate migration occurs and as displacement occurs, that migrants and migration themselves are not the threat. The challenge here is to ensure that migration, because it is happening and will continue to happen as people look for livelihoods and safety, the challenge is to ensure that that migration is safe and done in a regular manner. It's a challenge of governance, both national and international. It's also linked to urbanization policies, and I know that GWIPS has done research, and I recommend it, on building resilient cities. So it means that as we think about governance, it's not just on the literal immigration policy side, but it's also in how do we build more resilient urban centers in a way that's climate resilient, gender responsive, and then looks at disaster risk reduction with an inclusive lens. As I mentioned for the Caribbean, as people increasingly urbanize and live in that coastal line, they're also increasingly at risk from natural shocks and natural hazards. So thinking about all of these things in combination is critical. We know that as climate change reshapes migration patterns and displacement patterns, their movements will strain border policies and national security policies. And it's critical to help policymakers at the national and international level to think about this not as a security threat, but as a migration governance challenge, and to influence both regional and international frameworks on migration, on the environment, and on gender to think about these problems holistically. Thinking about the role of women, peace, and security and kind of women within this nexus, I think there are multiple key areas of focus. First is how do we get more women into leadership roles to push these issues to the table? And I think some of our wonderful panelists will be speaking about this issue on slightly different topics, but I'm excited to hear their perspectives there. Another perspective is how do we support the women that are already doing the work on the ground? There are so many women's organizations that are already active or women that are leaders in their community, but how do we support them? We know that 0.2, nothing of all philanthropic giving is provided to women-led environmental programs. We need to look at the climate finance mechanisms and channel both humanitarian aid and climate financing to women-led groups. I'll give you another example from Nepal, which is that a coalition of women came together and wrote a declaration that was basically a set of guidelines for responding to Nepali women's needs across a variety of socioeconomic statuses. We need to be putting money in the hands of folks on the ground who know their communities and know what they need, and amplify those voices from the local community, connecting international aid and international frameworks with the local needs. And then thirdly, I think the third area of focus that's critical is integrating some of these international and national frameworks. We need to think about preventing displacement in the first place. So that means building sustainable livelihoods that are gender responsive, investing in local conflict mediation, often done by women in local networks. In the unfortunate instance that people are displaced, how do we provide sustainable support to these displaced people that supports their need for livelihoods, but also protects the environment around them? I'll give you an example, which is the Renewable Energy for Refugees program run by UNHCR. And it supports 3 camps that host 50,000 Congolese refugees in Rwanda. They provide solar streetlights for safety in the camps, especially for women, but they also provide solar power in the home, which saves time for gathering fuel, which is also primarily done by women, and increases productive time. There's some evidence that this project has led to the building of businesses, including by women in the camps. Thinking about international frameworks, there's been quite a bit of success integrating gender into some of the big multilateral environmental agreements. And I have seen a major trend within kind of the international gender space or the women, peace, and security space in thinking about climate and disaster work. And I think WPS is really a leader in this side. I think women, peace, and security is uniquely situated to think about the humanitarian challenges and the disaster side of conflict, of climate change, and how that interrelates with communities already in conflict, or as migrants perhaps move from one community into another that will have conflict. I think there's a real role here for building out this research and thinking about how these things are interrelated. I think the challenge here is to bring these actors together. How do we continue pushing for international frameworks that do all of these things, or building them into regional frameworks? And I'll give you an example from the Caribbean again. The Caribbean, as a home to many small island developing states, is particularly affected by climate change. And they are a huge part of kind of international climate negotiations and discussion about displacement and migration and planned relocation. They have regional frameworks that allow for movement of people freely throughout the region. There are 2 different frameworks that facilitate it. And they're specifically using those frameworks to support people during disaster displacement. So in 2017, after Hurricane Maria, the island of Dominica was just devastated. But using this particular free movement regime, people from Dominica were able to leave to go to neighboring islands and then return once the hurricane had passed, and people from neighboring islands were able to come to Dominica to find work in construction and rebuilding industries. So thinking about how do we use migration tools and migration governance to more effectively manage disaster displacement and climate migration, and doing that with a gender responsive focus. I think the different parts are there. I think the challenge is integrating them more effectively in international regional agreements. That will facilitate better policymaking and also more inclusive response. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Muchas gracias, Brianna.
Thank you so much, Brianna, for your excellent disposal and willingness to be with us, Brianna. Now let's cordially welcome Elena Ambrosi, who is a director of the office of the High Commissioner for Peace in Colombia, the University of Andes, and she works on human rights, humanitarian work, and this for the Externado, the University of Colombia. Our institute gave her the annual award, the Hillary Clinton Award in 2017 for her role from the beginning in the Colombian peace process and agreement. Elena, we know you played a very important role in the peace negotiations in your country. In Colombia, you were one of the 3 women witnesses among the 17 signatories of the framework agreement negotiated in secret between both parts in Cuba and signed August 2012. You were involved in the peace process from the beginning, and the agreement was signed November 2016. That's when it was finished, rather. For people who do not know about the peace negotiations in Colombia in great detail, tell us about the risk against women, or that women faced in regions of war conflict in Colombia. Why was the participation of women so important in the peace negotiation? How did you reach this agreement in Colombia? And finally, what is happening now, 4 years after signing the peace agreement in your country?
Buenas
Yes.
tardes, muchísimas
Good
gracias,
afternoon.
Luis.
Thank you very
Un
much, Luis.
agradecimiento
I
especial
want to
también a la Universidad
especially
Iberoamericana
thank
y a
the
la
Iberoamericana University for inviting me to this fourth conference
Bueno,
on
yo
peace building from a gender
empezaría
perspective.
como
Let
con lo
me
que tú
start
estabas
out
contando un poco cómo fue el
with what you
proceso
said
para llegar a un acuerdo
about the process to
que
reach a
es
peace agreement in
considerado, y
my
lo
country.
mencionaba la embajadora Melán, como uno de los
This
acuerdos
is,
más
of
influyentes
course,
del mundo.
considered as one of the most
Nosotros
important peace
firmamos
agreements in the
finalmente el
world. We
acuerdo final
finally
el
signed
24
it
de noviembre de
November
2016,
24,
un acuerdo que puso
2016.
fin
It
a más de
was
50
an
años de
agreement putting an
conflicto con
end
las
to
FARC.
over 50
Las
years of
negociaciones
conflict with
para
the
llegar a
FARC.
ese acuerdo tuvieron dos fases
Negotiations for that
principalmente.
agreement
La
went
mencionabas tú,
through
una
different
primera fase,
phases. You
una fase
mentioned the first
secreta que
phase,
llamamos la fase
which is the secret
exploratoria,
phase,
que tuvo lugar
the
en La Habana y en
exploratory
la que
phase
básicamente lo que
taking place in
buscábamos
Havana.
era,
We were
antes de
seeking
iniciar cualquier proceso con
to
las FARC,
do this before
tener
starting
las
any process
garantías
with FARC.
suficientes de
First,
que
we
esta
wanted to
vez
have
sí
enough
había
guarantees
voluntad
that
real
this time there
de
was
avanzar
real
en la terminación
political
del
will to move
conflicto.
forward for
Esa
the
fase
agreement.
secreta terminó en agosto,
That
lo
secret
mencionabas tú, de
base
2012, y el
finished,
acuerdo que
that
firmamos
secret
definió
phase
la
rather finished in
visión del
August,
proceso de
and then we
negociación, la agenda,
continued
las
in the
reglas del
negotiating
juego,
process, the
y también lo
agenda, the rules
mencionabas
of the
tú,
game.
en esa fase
And as you have
ambas
mentioned,
delegaciones
in that
tenían
phase,
tres
both
negociadores
delegations had
principales,
3
ninguno de
main
estos era
negotiators,
mujer. Sin
no
embargo,
women
dentro
there.
del equipo de las
However,
personas, en el equipo del
in the
gobierno,
team,
habíamos dos mujeres, en el equipo de
there
las
was
FARC una,
2
y
women. I
las
was one
tres
of them.
suscribimos esa agenda del
And
acuerdo
3 of
general.
us
Luego inició
subscribed
a
the general
finales de
agenda. Then,
2012 esa
at the
fase
end
pública de conversaciones que
of that year,
tuvo
we started the
inicio en
conversations,
Oslo, en Noruega, y la
and
foto de
Norway, in
ese
Oslo,
inicio realmente
and the
marcó
picture of
mucho
that
a las organizaciones.
meeting
Había
really
5
marked
negociadores
organizations.
principales por cada
There were
una
5 main
de las partes,
negotiators for
porque
each
había
one of
con
the
las
parts
FARC,
involved,
y ninguno de estos
and
era una mujer.
none of them
Desde ahí
was a
empezó
woman.
realmente
So
lo que yo diría
that's
una
really
presión positiva de las
where a lot of
organizaciones de
positive
mujeres
pressure started
colombianas
from the
y
women's
también de la comunidad
organizations,
internacional por
and
tener una
also
mayor
pressure
inclusión
from the
de
international
mujeres
community
en
to
la
have
mesa de
more inclusion of
conversaciones.
women in the
Ya como
negotiating
un
table.
año después de iniciado
A year
la fase
after
pública de
the
conversaciones,
public phase of the
en
conversation
Bogotá
started in
tuvo
Bogotá,
lugar un espacio
we
realmente maravilloso,
had
la Cumbre
a
Nacional
marvelous
de
space,
Mujeres por
the
la Paz.
National
Se
Women's
reunieron las
Summit. This
plataformas
was
más
the Summit
importantes
of
de
Women for
organizaciones de
Peace,
mujeres
with
colombianas,
so many
con participación
organizations
de cerca de
of different
500
women,
lideresas de diferentes
5
partes del
women
territorio
leaders
nacional,
from
con el
throughout
fin de un poco
Colombia,
pensar
with
en
the purpose of
propuestas
thinking
para
about
garantizar que la
proposals to
implementación de los
guarantee
acuerdos tuviera un enfoque de
that
género.
the accords
Y
would
como
have a
conclusión
gender
de esa gran cumbre,
perspective. And
realmente
the
exigieron al
conclusion
gobierno,
of this summit
por una
was
parte, que se incluyeran las
insisting on the
conversaciones las
government to include
necesidades, los intereses, las
needs,
afectaciones del
interests,
conflicto en la vida de las
affectations of
mujeres.
the armed
Y por
conflict
otra
on
parte,
women in
la
Colombia,
necesidad de contar con
to
una mayor
include those
presencia y
needs and to have
participación de
more
mujeres
presence and
en todas
participation of
las
women
etapas de
as
las
well
conversaciones con las
throughout the
FARC.
stages
En
of the
respuesta, yo
conversations with
diría
FARC.
eso, y como les digo,
I would
también un
say
poco a esa
that's the
presión de
answer.
la comunidad
And there was
internacional,
pressure from
el
international
gobierno
community
finalmente
for this to
incluyó
happen.
dos
Finally, the Colombian
mujeres
government included
negociadoras
2
un mes
women, 2
después,
negotiating
en
women,
noviembre
a
de
month later,
2013, y las
November
FARC designó
2013.
una mujer
And the FARC
negociadora.
also
Al
appointed a
final, el acuerdo
woman
solamente fue
in the
suscrito por
negotiation
dos
process. At the
mujeres, por
end,
la
it was
canciller de
just
Colombia,
subscribed by 2
la mujer
women, the foreign
Victoria Salinas,
minister
por parte
and
de las FARC.
Victoria on the part of
En
the
paralelo,
FARC
sin embargo,
movement.
yo lideraba todo este
However,
equipo temático que era el encargado de
this
hacer las
was the
propuestas
negotiating
que se
team,
llevaban a la mesa de
and
conversaciones y participaba en la comisión de
was
redacción
part
de
of
los
the
acuerdos,
conversations
y veníamos
for the
pensando en
agreements.
realmente cómo
We
fortalecer
were
la
thinking
inclusión de esa
how
perspectiva
to
de género en
strengthen
los acuerdos
the
que ya
inclusion
habíamos
of gender
logrado,
perspective.
pero
This
también
is
cómo
something we had
garantizar que los
already
demás
accomplished, but how
tuvieran
to
mucha
guarantee
incorporada
for
esa
it to
perspectiva
stay
de
there
género, ese
and to
enfoque de
have this
género.
gender
Y así
perspective
nació una idea que
permanently.
yo creo que
So
realmente pues, fue la que
that's
permitió tener este
how
acuerdo incluyente, y
we
es la
started
subcomisión de género.
moving forward,
Esa
and we have the
subcomisión
Gender
inició a trabajar en
Subcommission.
2014,
It
revisando
started
todos los
working,
acuerdos que ya habíamos
reviewing all
alcanzado
the
para
agreements we
garantizar
had
esa
already
inclusión del
reached
enfoque
to
de género, y
guarantee
haciendo
the gender
recomendaciones a la
perspective and
mesa para
making
que los puntos
recommendations
restantes también
so
quedara
that
incluido.
those items would be included in the rest of the agenda. So the
de
negotiating
ambas
women were leading
delegaciones
that commission
que
in both delegations,
construyeron
and
las
they built
propuestas, digamos, sobre la base de
proposals
la
based
participación de las organizaciones
and the participation of women's organizations.
Más de 7,000
We
propuestas
had
de
received
cerca de
over
300
7,000
organizaciones de
proposals of
mujeres.
about 300
Habíamos
women's
invitado a la
organizations. We had invited to Havana 60 victims of the conflict, over 50% of them were women. We also invited women experts on sexual violence within the framework of the conflict, and foreign fighters, especially in Latin America, so that they would tell everyone about their experiences as guerrilla fighters, and they participated with their experiences. So it's finally the combination of women and the negotiating women, the group of women advisors supporting the process, plus, of course, the incidents, perseverance of the different organizations. That's how we were able to really participate and thus have an inclusive agreement at the end. It does three things, typifying everything, but in terms of gender, first, it recognizes the fundamental role women have played and still play in peace building. It also sets forth the need to have more active participation of women in different instances and of this process, and more political participation of women, and the strengthening of local organizations, among other measures. Second, the agreement recognizes inequality and discrimination. They are historic. Inequality and discrimination against women, the precarious situation of women out in the Colombian countryside, because they have lived under the conflict, and we promote affirmative actions for their rights and access to public services with more gender equity. Finally, the agreement recognizes a differentiated impact that this has had on the conflict has had on the lives of women, and we also talk about transitional justice instruments for women to have them, and for these instruments to have a gender perspective. Signed August 24th, that was the first time after a referendum, and this was on later on October 7th, October 2nd rather, 2016, and there were different governments against the agreement, and also against the political participation of the former FARC fighters. There was a lot of criticism and scandal around it. There was a third argument that became very strong in civil society, inclusion of gender perspective. I think it was ill-intended and a very opportunistic. It was used the wrong way. And this had nothing to do with what we had agreed. Throughout the campaign, there were the spokespersons for the no of the agreement. They said commitments reached on gender perspective in the agreement, wanted to position the gender ideology, that's what they called it. And they said, no, this affects marriages and families. And until now, I don't know how much weight this argument had for us to lose the referendum. Yes, and in a country of some 50 million inhabitants, only 20% of the population voted in this plebiscite, but they had done their work, and we needed to do more work. This is what we agreed. We started discussing why it's important for us to remember everything we have agreed on. Well, the agreement was finally passed by Congress. After being discussed, it became a cross-cutting type of situation. I don't know if more concessions were made, but we're not ready to make any concessions to the spokespersons of the no. What are we doing after 4 years? After the peace agreement, I would say we've made very important progress, but there are enormous challenges. Let me mention some general challenges first, and the main progress we've made, but also the challenges, because we have a lot of them. This plebiscite, no doubt, left a tremendously divided society. Implementation of the agreement right now is taking place, and there's a lot of profound political polarization. There's a lot of resistance as well in terms of the transitional justice model that was created, and there are things that others are proposing seeking to modify this. In terms of resources for the implementation of the agreement, I'm not working in the office of the High Commissioner for Peace anymore, but I am now working to look into the conflicts and the affectation. And we have to add the impact on the economy that COVID-19 will have on our economy. Colombia is going through a critical economic social situation. Experts talk about the most severe economic contraction ever in Colombia. There is no doubt that the biggest challenge we're now facing in the agreement, it has to do with peace building. This has to do with the territorial situation. This has been translated in the murder of leaders, displacements of people, and confinements, and problems with the mines, recruitment. About 238 ex-fighters, men and women, who've been murdered since the signing of the peace agreement. This means that when FARC withdrew from the territories they had occupied, there was no security for those territories. There was no strategy for that. And now there's a lot of controversy and dispute over those territories. Who is controlling them? And the legal rent for those territories. This is particularly grave because we thought that the peace agreements had to do with a very broad movement of participation with peace, of course, and those threats we now face and how local leaderships are being affected. Well, I think this is no good for peace building. I think something which is relevant here, because of the insistence and perseverance of women, in 2018, we were able to pass a comprehensive security program for women leaders and for women defending human rights. And we already have this with the participation of different entities and recommendations. It's moving slowly, but it is already being implemented. It recognizes the women leaders, women defending human rights, and the specific risks and hazards. And it also promotes particular measures to face up to those challenges of women in those territories. Now, after these general considerations, now I want to highlight the following. The agreement basically has 130 measures related to gender perspective. Those measures are part of indicators as well on progress for the peace agreement, and this is very important. The fact that there are different entities doing the follow-up for the implementation of the agreement, and we are making this visible to see how this is moving forward, how those measures are being implemented and honored. But right now, we see that measures related to gender perspective are moving very slowly in their implementation, slower than the rest of the agreement in general terms. 40% of the measures, according to that report, 40% of it has not even been started in terms of its implementation now. In terms of ceasefire and disarmament, well, we've had 2 UN missions, the first one in charge of doing the monitoring work, the second one in charge of verifying the situation in the territories and security guarantees. The first mission became a single model of monitoring process, and we showed the capacity women have to be leaders, and also men in operations of enormous complexity and difficulty. 1,100 monitors, the government, FARC, and the United Nations, 14% were women, and we wanted to have 20%, but it wasn't possible. So the UN holds that This is the type of mission with characteristic with the highest participation. And this is, of course, something which is mainly we have to take into account. And these are women in a gender group that's in charge of moving forward, and also in terms of security. And we have these reports that are very important to make this very visible, especially the progress we've had. And in terms of gender perspectives, in terms of reintegration, we have about 13,000 people that are now in the reintegration process. 35% about of those people are women. And from the beginning, because of their request of the former fighters, the women, we created a table, a working table for the follow-up of this process. And this was very important because we have specific gender perspectives being discussed in those panels, and we're talking to public officials, we're creating strategies for autonomy, and working with former women fighters. And we're also talking about different social services, and we are also hearing about the gender perspective in the programs for access and permanence of women in education systems, just to mention a few. However, this progress has the active participation of former fighters of these women. However, their participation is still limited because they're devoted to taking care of their families, and there are obstacles for them to participate in the decision-making process. Additionally, let me talk about progress in terms of meeting the needs and the rights of the victims. They are right at the center of the peace culture and peace building measures. We've been talking and working with them through a robust system, justice, truth, repair, and non-repetition. And this legacy is, there's enormous legacy of systematic violations of human rights, all types of violations. And this is something that comes from the conflict. So we're combining judicial mechanisms for investigation and sanction, and we want to have extrajudicial mechanisms through the Truth Commission and looking for the disappeared. And all this complements the repair work that we are doing because of the damage and the harm that was caused so many years of armed conflict. And in the special jurisdiction for peace, the court we created for justice being served, we have over 50% women in those instances. This is the first time in Colombia that a high court has a majority of women. The Truth Commission, 11 commissioners, 4 are women. And a woman is leading the search commission, and this has to do with gender commissions, guaranteeing that the gender perspective is in all the discussions and work. And also in Congress, we have a commission on sexual violence, and we've passed the participation of women's organizations with over 20 reports for the Peace Court, the Truth Commission, speaking about gender-based violence. And this is taking place all over the country. And in the Peace Court, we have a special unit in charge of sexual violence within the framework of the conflict. We have another program for the protection of victims of sexual violence. And we've also recognized victims, sexual victims, and impact and the violations of those women throughout the armed conflict. Throughout the Truth Commission, this is also being done. However, the women's organizations have insisted that to truly
esa
overcome
invisibilización histórica de las afectaciones
historic
de las mujeres en
invisibility
particular de la
of
violencia
women,
sexual sufrida por
especially in
mujeres
terms of
durante el
sexual
conflicto.
violence or the
Es
victims of
fundamental
sexual
abrir un caso de
violence.
violencia
It's
sexual
important to
o de
open
violencias
a
basadas en género,
case
aún ese
of
caso no se ha abierto.
gender
En materia de reconocimiento de responsabilidad,
violence
sabemos por
cases, and
experiencias
we
en otros
know
países que los
from the experience in
reconocimientos de
other countries
responsabilidad en temas de
how
violencia
important
sexual
it
son
is to first
complejos y de hecho en
recognize
Colombia aún
responsibility.
no se avanza
And in
en
Colombia,
ese
we
tema.
haven't yet
Y en materia de
moved forward
reparación,
on this.
pues nosotros
And
tenemos
in
la
terms of repairs,
cifra de
well,
9
we have a
millones de
dramatic
personas
figure of 9 million
víctimas del
people,
conflicto
victims
reconocidas. De estas
of
9
the
millones,
conflict
cerca del
recognized out the 9
son
million.
mujeres y
50%
realmente la
are
reparación
women,
avanza
and
de
really
muy lento.
the repair
Para terminar,
work is
simplemente
not
quisiera
moving
decir que
as
la
fast as we
pandemia ha
want.
venido a
To
profundizar esta
conclude, let me
situación
tell
y
you
la
that
agilidad de discriminación
COVID-19 has made the situation even worse now. And this is something that the ambassador Milan already mentioned. This is terrible because we want the peace agreement to guarantee greater gender equity. According to official figures, unemployment of women is over 20% in Colombia, men 12% unemployment rate. In rural poverty, this is, of course, the main focus of the peace agreements, and this had increased since last year. In this context, this participation and the participation of women, well, this is something that we're working on, and this is systematic poverty that we have to look into. And women are doing house chores, no one pays them for it, and low revenues, low salaries. This is a structural characteristic of the labor market, and this is becoming even worse with this pandemic if we don't adopt the necessary measures immediately for women to participate in more productive initiatives. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you, Elena, for your important presentation that has given us so much food for thought. Thank you. Now let's give the floor to Lucibunda, who will be talking about violence against women, specifically in Mexico. She is the spokesperson of Las Brujas del Mar Collective. They organized the national stoppage of women called One Day Without Us in Mexico, March 9th in Mexico, within the framework of the Women's International Day. And millions of women in Mexico stayed home. They didn't work. They didn't go out to work, and they were not taking care of others, remembering everyone, the important role women of all ages perform, all races, all economic situations, all the work they do for democracy to work. And Arusi is a marketing expert, abolitionist, a feminist, and defender of women's rights. And the US magazine, Time magazine, has named her as one of the most influential women of this year, 2020. Arusi, welcome. What a pleasure having you. Could you please tell us about the serious problem of violence against women? Could you explain to us how it is that you started this Brujas del Mar, the Witches of the Sea collective, and tell us about how this women's stoppage process started? Why was it important and what it is that you have accomplished? Arusi, you have the floor.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Muchísimas gracias por hacernos parte de este panel. Bueno, creo que empezaríamos platicando un poquito acerca de nosotras, lo que hacemos. Yo soy vocera del colectivo Las Brujas del Mar. Nosotras somos de Veracruz, México. En 2019, Veracruz fue el estado número 1 en cifras de feminicidios a nivel nacional, y en lo que va del 2020 se posiciona en el número 2.
True.
Nosotras realmente surgimos de la necesidad de encontrar un espacio feminista en nuestra
Need
localidad.
of finding a feminist space in our town where we could exchange opinions and we could exchange debates on different topics in feminism, but the needs to start talking as a collective group and to be a little bit more activist to see how we can help women. We are not part of Colectivas until the end of September 2019. And during that period of time, we went on a nationwide network with our collectives, and within this groups, we started working nationwide, and there was a proposal or an idea of Vanessa Bauchi. We took over this and we relaunched it on February 2020, and we were visible a little bit more nationwide because there was a response, a huge response. And I believe that this huge response to shared situation within the society, because a little bit before, the feminicide of Ingrid Escamilla had asked, and then Fatima Cecilia. But we were not out of one when the other one was already started looking into how this damaged the entire society. A little bit later, there was a call of the nationwide stop, and this was the awareness, the stop that something very serious is happening. And the collectives, the feminist collectives and the defendants of the women's right, this violence in Mexico became worse, and it is unsustainable now. This obviously results in massive situation with women stopping. When we had all the women walking, marching, throughout in Mexico City, there were even cities where we had women presenting like never before. That was waking up in the awareness, how we go to action, how can we stop this problem. It's been very difficult because from the institutions, from the government, from the three levels of government, there have been some actions that make it more complicated. Reports, that were cutting funds from women's violence against women is structural, and most of this becomes a family issue. The demonstrations are huge. When the pandemic happened and we had to stay home, they said that inside the house there are those that abuse women and girls. This is resulting in an increase of violence against women and girls during the pandemic. This is even worse when the resources have taken at the Executive Commission of Attention to Victims. They have taken the resources to shelters for women that are victims of violence, among others. So this closes the doors for action that could be implemented to rescue these women that are being victims of violence. We have to understand that this doesn't come overnight. It's been around for some time. If it's not from the beginning of times, there's a system, there's a structure that places women in disadvantage, not only in Mexico, but this is a problem that is hitting us worldwide. In a Latin American context, it's a little bit worse because there's no care. They're not having an understanding of where this problem is coming from. And there's a lot of omission, indifference, because it's very difficult to realize that feminicide or female homicide is the last link in a chain of violence. Is the worst way to commit violence against a woman, but there are prior links to start to increase the feminicide crisis. And this is something that nobody understands from the institution, from the government, from society. We're all upset because when we see in the news the case of feminicide, however, other types of symbolic violence, economic, psychological, emotional, that every day we can see in our spaces against women and girls. In order to cut down the gap of violence against women, we have to be aware what we're facing. Where is the violence? Unfortunately, violence is all over. It's in public spaces,
Espacio que debería ser más seguro para nosotras.
space that should be safer for us, our home.
Nada más por decir algunos datos.
As an example, 2 out of every 3 women have faced violence in Mexico before they are 15. 41.3% have been victims of sexual violence. Currently, we have a large number of women that are murdered every day. 88.4 women do not file a complaint. There's a 91% of impunity in the case of gender violence. Domestic violence grew 60% during the pandemic. There's a gap of salary, the worst one in Latin America, that is on average 16%. 33% of Mexican homes are supported by single mothers. And even though when they're fathers, the absence of a male figure, it's 6 out of every 10 homes. Non-remunerated work, forget about it. Women are the ones that work in the informal market. They don't have benefits as provided by law. They don't have a system to support what they do. Housing fund, retirement fund. There's still a lot to do in order to reach fairness. But besides that, something that we should be looking into is that we're fighting for our dignity, so we're not murdered, so we're not raped. And this is sad. We don't even know how to call the public and private institutions, and that's why we're trying to focus our effort of social call to understand systemic violence that all women are going through, and they become worse. Is exceptional. If we see this from the point of view that indigenous women and women that are poor, women that are part of LGBT, they go from double or triple or fourfold. How do we generate this awareness? By not having any tolerance with any type of violence against women. We must understand that the omission is also complicity. We have to understand that we're part of the chain. There's something that shouldn't stop things and not to raise our voice because of this. I would like to understand that we have to take care of the structural causes of violence against women and girls from the basis. We need to promote frameworks from public policies that are intercultural with feminism perspective and with a focus in human rights. Right now, we do not have coordinated strategies to fight the situation from the executive nor from any of the branches. And there's nothing more than to keep calling the government, public and private groups in order to prevent, sanction, and to eradicate violence against women in the country. Right now, we need to all get involved. We cannot just look the other way. 11 women are being murdered right now in Mexico.
Muchísimas gracias, Arusi.
Thank you, Arusi.
Quedan muchas preocupaciones.
There's so many concerns for our audience.
Bueno, ahora para seguir aumentando a estos temas, vamos a tomar
To continue adding to these topics, we're going to take some of the questions from the audience, please. If you can ask your questions by using the chat,
y seguiremos con sus preguntas.
and we will continue.
Bueno, por el momento parece que no.
Okay, we don't have any questions right now.
Entonces, seguiremos a la conclusión.
So we would move to the conclusions.
Esperemos que les hayan beneficiado participando.
We hope that you had a benefit in participating and understanding a little bit more about the three perspectives of the agenda of women, peace, and security. I want to thank our dear panelists. It was a pleasure to be part of this. And now I give the floor to Elvia so she can close this 4th Congress of Peace Building with gender perspective. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I think we had a question, how the climate change affect peace and safety. Maybe somebody can answer that.
Parece que esta pregunta es dirigida quizás a Brianna.
Brianna?
Hi, I'm happy to answer. I just want to make sure I understand it's more broadly about how climate change affects peace and security. Sure. I'd say my a summary of it, even though it would look different in different communities, would be that climate change increases the intensity or frequency of events that cause communities to be vulnerable, right? Whether that's displacement or lacking livelihoods as crops change or as agricultural conditions change. I think climate change is a vulnerability multiplier. And if you're living in a community that perhaps is already experiencing tensions or lack of resources, that makes that struggle over resources even more complex or even more competitive, perhaps. So I think there's a chance to lead to conflict within communities. And then certainly after displacement happens, that competition can be even more severe or more dire for those communities. And certainly if people are moving into new communities where there were resource challenges, there can be conflict between the existing community and the new migrants or new members of that community. So I think that's the overarching, though. Different communities, it looks differently, right? And when we think about women, I think we think about the particular gendered risks for women in those scenarios. I know we've talked, and the other panelists have spoken very eloquently to the challenges that women face, including gender-based violence, as these changes happen. But recognizing that women are key to the agricultural sector and key in caregiving in their communities, they're particularly affected in whatever type of conflict occurs, and also should be included in whatever type of peace building is supported at the local level.
Gracias, Brianna. Parece que tenemos
Thank
una
you, Brianna.
pregunta.
We might have another question.
En un mundo que sigue
In a
marcado por
world
las
that
discriminaciones
continues to be marked by multiple discriminations, how do we start thinking about strategies when we start building or thinking peace with gender perspective? How important is this? Elena,
¿puede ser esta pregunta para ti?
can you answer this question, please?
No, pues yo creo que, y lo decía la embajadora Melania,
As Ambassador Melana mentioned, there's
no hay una paz que realmente pueda considerarse
women's right. No peace can be sustainable without women. Peace with women means facing some of the causes that are structural in discrimination, violence, marginalization, and that women have gone through, and in armed conflict that I have worked and I have studied. They are hurt tremendously. So really, today, we're talking about the peace in the sense that peace without women is not peace. We can't say that that a peace can be stable and long-lasting if we don't see it this way. In Colombia, we had to face this, and we have different fields, and we have defined what the different topics were, and that's what we're trying to do all the time. These are topics that are highly of high concern, and we consider three main topics: victimization suffered by women, not only how to face it, but to provide a good answer that need to be part of the organizations in society, these organizations of women, so we can solve so many things: education, health, and at the end, to cut down those gaps, like they're doing in Mexico, not only in the work place, but in different spaces. We have to get rid of these obstacles for access, and this only happens with structural helps, but also with affirmative measures at country level.
Gracias, Elena.
Thank you, Elena.
Es una pregunta para
We have one question for Arusi.
México tiene una política
Mexico has a feminist foreign policy. What are leaders at the government doing with respect to violence against women in Mexico? Being honest, not much. I believe that it's very serious that they're not even taking the smallest action, at least, speaking against the acts of violence that have moved the country. There's an amazing silence when the female homicide occurs or hatred crime against women happens from the government. So really, this is of great concern. I have to acknowledge the efforts by women legislators and women in the House to try to work here. The 3D3 was approved recently against violence that does not allow people to get into legislation to men that have been abusive with women. I think it's a great small victory within this climate of so much violence against women. So the truth is that we're fighting it, but there's no acknowledgement, like in the second report by the president. he doesn't talk about the crisis of violence against women that we're going through as in the country. And I think it's a great concern that he didn't do it.
En este momento, ¿qué acciones de impacto desde el marco de la academia?
Right now, what impact actions from the academia can be set forward to protect lives and stop violence against women?
Esta es otra pregunta para Lucy.
Arusi? I believe that from all spaces and from all over, we have work to do to defend the lives and the dignity of women. Often we think that that work is more like being activist and to defend human rights and so on. But I believe, and if I have learned something when we have been working with Las Brujas del Mar, is that anyone can perform a lot of actions, from reporting, condemning acts of violence against girls and children, to close the door on those that attack them, to be able to listen to them. With any type of action that contributes to the fight against the dignity of women, this is enough. If we all work on this to face this problem, I'm sure that little by little we can see positive results. Thank you. This question is for Ambassador Milan. What is the role that WIPS considers? What is the role of DRITS? Considers that it's the role of the universities to go over the items in the agenda on peace and security.
Well, if I understand the question, it has to do with what role can the universities play on this agenda?
Yes.
I think one of the most important things we can do, and it also refers to the earlier question about universities. Universities have a real opportunity, given the expertise, to look at the problem, to record data, to analyze it, to be advocates for it, to convene their big platforms on it and bring critical people in government to address these issues. So like Arusi said, every segment of the population has much they can do on this issue, whether it's violence against women or it's the role of women in peace and security. And I think the universities have a very significant role that they can play. And I salute Iberoamericano for this conference, for example, which is raising awareness on these critical issues. And that will lead to others doing more. But I think particularly in the area of research and creating awareness and education and using that platform.
Gracias, embajadora. Bueno,
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. We have time for maybe 2 more questions, and they're both for Arusi. The first one is, what were the advances and challenges after the national demonstration of women at the beginning of the year? And it hurts not to know and what to do after listening to everything. We all need to look at this is more common, you know, we all have a role to play. What were the advances and challenges after the national demonstration of women? I think the protest of women, the advances have been So many. From the civil society, many legislators, many members of Congress, they're really moving within their own area to try to make things fair for all of us. However, there's a lot of resistance, if I can be honest with you. I think things are moving like we have never seen in, or we have not seen in a long time. In the decentralization of this fight, this is something that has really been getting our attention. Mobilizations in so many cities that are around Mexico City, they're becoming stronger and stronger. So within the same resistance that I mentioned, we also see a lot of cases of police repression, and the one that has captured more attention with our colleagues in Cancun that was huge. I don't know really what to say with respect to advances that have been, very specific. I could talk to you more about social advances that there's the society is very upset. You can feel it in the air. There are actions that are taking place. Women are getting, or we are getting organized. We're articulating everything. We're are looking into how to create more networks, women's attorneys, psychologists looking for medications, for care, for shelters, all over the place. This is one of the most severe consequences in favor of women, not only from this march, but from the situation really calls for it. And this situation really moves me, makes me be a little bit more hopeful, adding to the comment. It was not a question mark, a comment. This is very strong. To think that that we're closing this circle, that to be able to walk out of our homes or go out of the house not being afraid, but at the same time see so many women really putting everything forward, going out in the street, marching out in the streets from their spaces, from their cities, from their local communities. We should really feel hopeful. I'm a bit hopeful.
Gracias, Lucy.
Thank you, Lucy. I want to thank once again for the participation of all of you, our distinguished members of the panel, and to Ibero. Thank you. Elvia, you have the floor. Thank you, Luis. Yes. We want to thank this wonderful panel organized by Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. Of course, the panelists that participated, we really thank Brianna, Elena, Ambrosi, and of course, we want to thank Ambassador Melan Barber and our colleague Dulce, who was here with us, everybody that has been here with us. And to close, I want to thank all the organizations, universities, among which we have the group of the Institute of Peace and Security in Georgetown that trusted us one more time to join this initiative, who participated somehow with a panel supporting everything in any possible way they were able to participate. We want to thank you for your support. And of course, the school of and to our school, to all our programs, to have this Congress, everyone, the entire team from our team of teaching with technologies. They have helped us with the Zoom platform, the entire team that have helped us to record the sessions in different languages. Of course, Jorge Romero, who has been supporting us throughout all of this. A big hug to all of you, and we'll see what happens next year. Thank you so much.
Gracias. Muchísimas gracias.